In the remote highlands of northern Vietnam, beyond the reaches of modern roads and mobile signals, lies a cluster of forgotten villages nestled deep within the mist-wrapped mountains. These are places where ancient beliefs still guide daily life, where the spirits of the land are both feared and worshipped, and where outsiders rarely step, and even more rarely return. Eliot Tran, a 29-year-old Vietnamese-American documentary filmmaker, had spent the past 3 years chasing dying rituals and endangered cultures across Southeast Asia. When he received a cryptic message from an anonymous sender, a single sentence that read "Find the moon people before the eclipse," he was intrigued, but skeptical. Attached was a pixelated image, a faded black and white photograph of villagers in ceremonial garb, their eyes covered with cloth, standing in front of a stone altar beneath a crescent moon. He scoured forums and contacted cultural historians, but no one had ever heard of a moon cult in Vietnam. One professor suggested it might be a fusion of local animist beliefs and lunar worship, long buried by time or repression. That was all Eliot needed. Within 2 weeks, he was on a bus rattling through narrow mountain passes, his camera gear strapped beside him and a single goal in mind, to uncover a story that no one else had dared to tell. Locals in nearby towns avoided his questions. "No such people live here," one old man told him, not meeting his eyes. "The moon brings silence. You should not look for what hides in darkness." But silence only made Eliot more curious. Guided by a poorly translated map, he hiked into the dense forest for 2 days, accompanied only by a local translator named Mai, who agreed to help, for triple her normal rate. She spoke little during their journey, except to mutter warnings under her breath when night fell. "Do not stare at the moon too long," she whispered one evening by the fire. "It can make you forget who you are." By the time they reached the edge of the forgotten valley, dusk had begun to creep over the ridges. The air was thinner here, and colder. Below them, cradled in the arms of 2 steep mountains, was a village untouched by time, homes built from black wood, smoke curling from fires, and in the center of it all, a strange stone monolith carved with crescent shapes, pulsing faintly in the fading light. Something in Eliot's chest tightened. He didn't know yet, but he had just crossed into a place that lived outside the boundaries of normal time, and beyond the reach of reason. As Eliot and Mai descended the final slope into the valley, a deep stillness settled around them. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, had vanished. Only the crunch of their boots on dirt and the occasional distant howl of wind filled the silence. The village was smaller than Eliot expected. Perhaps 20 or 30 homes, all constructed from dark wood and roofed with layered bark. No power lines. No satellite dishes. Just smoke rising lazily from chimneys and small paths woven between the houses like veins in a leaf. As they entered, villagers stopped what they were doing. Women paused their washing. Children ran behind doorways. An elder sharpening a knife froze, watching them with eyes that seemed impossibly still, as if carved from stone. Eliot offered a polite smile and a small wave. "Xin Chào," he greeted in Vietnamese, hoping to break the tension. No one replied. Only Mai's voice broke the silence. "They know why you're here," she said quietly beside him. "They feel it." A group of 4 men appeared from a longhouse at the far end of the village. All wore dark indigo robes embroidered with silver crescent moons across the chest. Their heads were shaved, and each carried a staff topped with a carved animal skull: crow, boar, fox, and snake. The tallest man approached Eliot and Mai. His face was unreadable, his voice low but firm. "You've come for the moon," he said in clear Vietnamese. "You are late. The eclipse comes soon." Mai translated quickly, then added in a hushed tone, "He means the ritual begins in 3 nights. Eliot nodded. "I'm here to observe, to learn. I want to understand." The man paused, scanning Eliot's face as if measuring his soul. Then he gave a single nod and turned on his heel. "You will stay with the storyteller," he said, and began walking. They were led through narrow paths and past faces peeking from behind wooden walls, all watching in absolute silence. No smiles. No curiosity. Just eyes, always the eyes. At the edge of the village stood a solitary hut surrounded by hanging bone charms and dyed cloth strips that fluttered even without wind. The door creaked open before they reached it. A woman stood there, old and bent, her hair long and white like silken threads of spiderweb. Her eyes, pale and glassy, stared into nothing, yet Eliot felt as though she was staring straight through him. "This is Balan," said the last moon storyteller. Inside, the hut smelled of herbs and ash. Bones hung from the rafters. Ancient symbols were carved into every wall and beam. In the center, a low mat faced a polished stone basin filled with water. Eliot couldn't help but glance into it, and for a moment, swore he saw not his own reflection, but the face of a pale child submerged beneath the surface. He blinked. The water was still. Balan sat cross-legged and gestured for them to join her. Slowly, Eliot unpacked his camera and voice recorder, asking for permission. She smiled, the first smile he'd seen since entering the village, and spoke in a slow, melodic voice that Mai began to translate. "Long ago," she began, "the moon was not a light. It was a mouth. And every 100 years, that mouth opens to feed." For the next 2 days, Eliot filmed everything he was permitted to, the village, the rituals, the faces. The villagers never protested, but their silence weighed heavier with each passing hour. No laughter, no idle chatter, not even the barking of dogs. It was as if the entire place existed inside a held breath. At night, the valley grew impossibly dark. The moon hung low and unnaturally bright, painting the mountains in silver. The villagers lit no fires. Only faint candlelight glowed through slivers of doorways, like eyes watching from the dark. Eliot stayed inside Balan's hut, reviewing his footage. But something was wrong. Each time he played back the clips, faint whispers leaked through the audio, not static, but voices. Low, rhythmic chanting. He checked his microphone, replayed the scene, and the whispers remained, even when the camera had been turned off. Mai noticed his unease. "You should delete those," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the flickering candle. "Recording what belongs to the moon can make it follow you." Eliot tried to laugh it off, but her expression never changed. The next morning, he followed the men in indigo robes as they prepared for the ritual. They painted symbols on the ground using a thick, dark paste that smelled of iron and earth. Children carried bowls of water to a central pit, a shallow depression surrounded by standing stones etched with crescent marks. Balan sat near the edge, humming to herself, her voice trembling like a flute made of bone. "What happens during the eclipse?" Eliot asked, crouching beside her. She did not look at him. Her milky eyes stared toward the mountains. "When the sky turns red," she said slowly, "the moon calls. The villagers must answer. Or it will take its own." Mai hesitated before translating. "She says, it is not a choice." That night, Eliot couldn't sleep. The air was heavy, electric, as if a storm were trapped in the valley but never broke. The constant hum of insects had vanished again. Only the sound of wind slipping through the cracks of the hut remained. At one point, he woke to find Mai standing near the doorway, staring outside. The moonlight poured through the gap, illuminating her face, blank, distant, eyes wide open. "Mai," he whispered. She didn't answer. He stood and gently touched her shoulder. She blinked hard, as if waking from a dream, and stumbled back. "I heard them," she murmured. "They were calling my name." Eliot glanced outside. The village square was empty, yet he could swear he saw figures moving beyond the tree-line. Thin silhouettes shifting between the trees, their heads tilted upward, toward the moon. When he turned back, Balan was awake too, watching him with a faint, knowing smile. "The moon remembers those who look at it," she said softly. "Soon, it will look back." The morning before the eclipse dawned gray and unnaturally still. A mist rolled through the valley, clinging to the homes and smothering sound. It seemed as though even time itself had slowed. Eliot awoke to a low, droning chant outside. When he stepped from the hut, he found the villagers gathered in a wide circle around the crescent pit. Every one of them wore dark robes now, even the children, and their eyes were covered with strips of cloth dyed in deep indigo. Despite their blindness, their movements were synchronized, precise, and rhythmic, as if guided by an unseen hand. Balan stood nearby, placing carved bone totems at the edge of the ritual space. Her fingers moved with speed and certainty, each item placed with purpose. "What are these for?" Eliot asked, carefully filming from the perimeter. She did not look at him. "They mark the boundary between the waking world and the hollow sky," she replied. I stood close beside Eliot, tense. "She says, once the eclipse begins, the sky becomes a doorway. And through that doorway, something watches." Eliot's camera trembled slightly in his hands. Throughout the day, preparations continued. The villagers constructed tall wooden spires around the pit, each wrapped in cloth and bone charms. They formed concentric rings around the central space, symbolizing the lunar cycles. In the very center, a flat stone altar was cleaned and covered with an ancient cloth embroidered in silver thread, worn with age, but unmistakably detailed. A figure was depicted in the embroidery, a tall, faceless shape crowned by a crescent moon. That night, no one spoke. The village was wrapped in a silence so deep it felt alive. Eliot sat with Mai and Balan, watching the moon rise through a crack in the clouds. It was full now, massive, almost swollen, casting an eerie blue-white glow over the valley. "Tell me the truth," Eliot whispered to Balan. "Is this just a story? A legend?" The old woman was quiet for a long time. Then, with a voice like rustling leaves, she said, "The moon does not grant light. It takes. It reflects what it sees. That is why you must never let it see who you really are." She turned her face toward him then, blind eyes glimmering faintly. "That's why we wear the blindfolds." Eliot's breath caught. Mai added, voice barely audible, "She says, if the moon sees your soul, it can pull it through. And you may not return the same." Later that evening, Eliot reviewed some of the footage he had captured. One particular shot, a wide frame of the villagers dancing in blindfolded circles, seemed strange. He paused the clip and leaned in. In the shadows beyond the outer ring of dancers, barely visible, were three tall figures. Unmoving. Watching. He scrubbed back, frame by frame. The figures weren't there before. But they were there now. And they weren't villagers. He looked outside. The mist had thickened again. And the moon had begun to bleed at its edge. The first scream came just after midnight. It wasn't loud, more like a gasp swallowed by the fog, but Eliot heard it. It came from the far end of the village, near the edge of the forest. He jumped to his feet, camera in hand, but Mai grabbed his wrist hard. "Don't go," she whispered. "It's starting." Outside, the air was charged, humming like a wire about to snap. The moon had risen to its highest point, but now it was changing, a shadow creeping across its surface, blotting out its glow. Slowly, the silver disk darkened to a deep crimson. The eclipse had begun. The villagers gathered in absolute silence around the crescent pit. All were blindfolded, heads bowed. The elders stood in the inner circle, their faces marked with red pigment, holding long wooden staffs. Balan stood at the altar, arms raised toward the sky, murmuring in a language Eliot didn't recognize, low, guttural syllables that seemed to echo unnaturally through the air. The drumming began. It was slow at first, a single heartbeat repeated over and over from unseen hands. Then came the chants, not from the villagers, but from the forest. Deep, resonant voices rising from the trees. Not human. Eliot began filming, heart pounding. Through the camera lens, the world seemed surreal, movements slowed, shadows lengthened, the villagers swayed in hypnotic rhythm. But what the lens captured that his eyes did not, were figures. Dozens of them. Tall, thin, featureless beings standing beyond the stone circle, half hidden in mist. They had no faces, no mouths, only smooth, elongated heads and limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. They watched. Unmoving. And then one of them stepped forward. The blindfolded villagers parted, as if sensing its presence, letting it pass. It entered the center circle and stood before Balan. She bowed. And without a word, the creature raised a long, spindly arm and touched her forehead. Her body crumpled instantly, like a puppet with its strings cut. Eliot gasped. I screamed. But no one else moved. The ritual continued. More creatures emerged from the forest. One by one, they approached the altar, touching villagers as they passed. Each person fell, silently, lifelessly. But their faces, they were not of pain. They were serene. Peaceful. As if surrendering to something beautiful, something final. Eliot couldn't stop filming. Even as tears ran down his face, even as I begged him to look away, he kept the camera on them. I have to document this, he whispered. People have to know. But then, one of the creatures turned toward him. And this time, it did have a face. A mirror. A perfect reflection of Eliot's own, expressionless, hollow-eyed, staring back at him from across the pit. The camera dropped from his hands. He could feel something pulling at his thoughts, unraveling them like thread. The moon above, now fully eclipsed, a black hole rimmed with fire, pulsed like a living eye. Watching. Feeding. And inside Eliot's mind, a voice not his own whispered. We do not come for blood. We come for memory. You look too long. When Eliot woke, the moon was gone. The eclipse had passed. Dawn was breaking over the misty peaks, bathing the valley in pale orange light. But everything was silent. He lay on the cold ground near the altar. His body ached. His mind was fogged, like waking from a dream that had no beginning. Beside him, Mai knelt quietly, her eyes red, hands trembling. Her blindfold was torn, discarded in the dirt. Around them, the ritual site was empty. No villagers. No bodies. No footprints. The pit was clean. The standing stones stood unmarked. Even the bone totems had vanished. Eliot stumbled to his feet, scanning the village. It was still there, the houses, the paths, but lifeless. Doors hung open. Fires had gone cold. No sign of struggle, but no sign of anyone at all. It was as if the entire population had melted into the earth. Eliot found his camera lying exactly where he dropped it. He picked it up and checked the footage. Gone. Every file from the past 3 days was corrupted. Black static, distorted audio, glitching fragments of light and shadow. Only one clip remained, a 5-second video, unmarked by time or title. He played it. It was a close-up of his own face. Except he wasn't holding the camera. The footage was perfectly steady, focused on Eliot as he stood wide-eyed and expressionless, staring upward. Behind him, the moon glowed red. And just before the clip ended, Eliot's reflected image smiled, slow and unnatural. He dropped the camera. What did we see? He whispered. Mai shook her head. It wasn't meant for us. Together, they left the valley. They hiked for hours in silence, following the fading trail through the mountains until they reached the edge of the forest. When they emerged, a trucker spotted them and took them back to the nearest town. Eliot tried to explain what had happened, but when he described the village, the officials claimed no such place existed. Nothing lives that deep in the mountains, they told him. Those trails are long closed. He showed them the video. They watched it. Then they asked him to leave. Back in the US, Eliot tried to write about it. To warn others. But every time he sat down to tell the story, his memory blurred, names vanished, voices twisted, and dreams flooded in. He'd wake up with moonlight on his face, and whispers in a language he didn't know. Eventually, he stopped trying. Until one day, months later, a package arrived at his door. No return address. Inside was a single photo. Black and white. Faded. It showed a group of villagers in ceremonial robes. Standing in front of the stone altar. Eyes blindfolded. And at the center of the group, holding a staff, was him. Eliot Tran. expressionless, staring straight at the camera. Beneath the photo, scrawled in trembling ink, were the words, "When the moon returns, so will you."